Kane Parsons becoming the youngest director to have an $80+ million domestic debut last weekend. It's safe to say, after multiple decades of Hollywood disrespecting the influences of younger generations, such as through the atrocious Ready Player One, that the door is finally open. But it may look like a wall in a furniture store. Hey, Zach Glenn, aka Glenn the Golden. Now that almost everyone else has gone to see the Backrooms over the weekend, I want to do the same thing as all of my ceaseless watchers and discuss the movie. But first, my little spiel. I'm trying to bring my following from Twitter and Spotify over to YouTube and grow it. Every subscription, comment, and like helps. So if you're interested in horror or a left-wing and conspiratorial lens for examining the world, I'd love to have you as part of the Golden Order. The first detail that I want to discuss about the Backrooms movie is one detail that I feel like I'm seeing the most disagreement about online. What new rules do we learn about Kane Parsons' interpretation of the Backrooms? One aspect of the Backrooms that is mostly unexplored within the original web series, but is heavily explored within the film, is the idea that the Backrooms is a psychosphere. However, unlike the popular conception of a psychosphere in philosophy, the Backrooms is a location that you can physically go to. A psychosphere is another way of referring to the collective unconscious or collective thoughts of all of mankind. But there are some key differences with how the Backrooms works versus the actual philosophical construct of a psychosphere. The first rule that's different from the idea of the psychosphere is that the Backrooms encroaches on our reality in specific areas. I've seen them called doorways, gateways, and null zones before, but the important thing to remember is that there are specific areas in the world of Parsons' Backrooms where the border between the two separate realities is weak. The reason that weak connection is important is that it is my interpretation that these areas of weakness form the borders of where the Backroom is able to pull from memories of people who are nearby. Essentially, unlike the philosophical concept of the psychosphere, the Backrooms is only capable of building itself based on the memories of those inside or those near null zones. The Backrooms requires proximity. Another idea I want to address that I've seen quite a bit is one that I don't think is quite correct. I've seen the idea that the Backrooms feeds off the trauma of the people who are there. Or similarly, that the Backrooms makes doubles of people based on the trauma that they've shown. I've even seen the idea floated that the only reason that Mary, Clark's therapist, has a double revealed at the end of the film is that the Backrooms was able to make a double based off of the psychic energy that she projects from having to relive her own childhood confinement. There's evidence directly in the film that the Backrooms does not need your own traumatized memories to make doubles, though, because Clark, the furniture store owner, finds a double of his wife. We can also look at what Clark says to Mary when he's explaining the doubles to her. He doesn't tell her that someone who looks like the man in the wheelchair came into the Backrooms at one point. He tells her that somewhere out there is someone who looks like this man in the wheelchair. I've heard a lot of people say that the information that's coming out from the characters about the Backrooms is coming from unreliable narrators. However, there's reason to think that Clark is speaking from a place where he's well informed for two reasons. The first is that he initially had a great deal of interest in mapping out the Backrooms and understanding how the Backrooms work because of his history as a failed architect. The second reason is that after seeing his ex-wife's double and knowing that she hasn't been in the Backrooms, he was probably able to deduce that people do not need to be in the Backrooms for the Backrooms to try to remember you. In short, the line from the trailer about the Backrooms remembering, and the more times it remembers, the less details it does. He just says the more times it remembers, the less it does, but that's what he's saying. This is the closest that we receive to word of God about how the Backrooms works. Most of the details that we learn in this story, other than the information about the psychosphere nature of the Backrooms, are learned about Async, which is really the organization that primarily moves the plot along in the web series. In the web series, Async is able to discover ways to intentionally create doorways to the Backrooms using electromagnets. In the movie, it is revealed that they were originally in the business of making MRI machines. On this channel, I've talked about how lore and world building aren't truly necessary components of storytelling. However, if you're going to do additional world building details like this is the way to do it. Not only does it tell us more about Async, which is something fans have wanted to know based on online discussions, but it also ties in thematically with the idea of the Backrooms as a psychosphere, because MRI technology is primarily used for brain scans. The two other details that we learn about Async go together somewhat. The first is that they are treating the exploration of the backrooms similarly to astronauts in space, which really works to tie the aesthetics of Async's contamination suits, which look similar to spacesuits, with the themes of the story. The clue to the audience lies in the caveman cardboard cutouts that are discovered by both Clark and Mary when they explore. It seems that a lot of people missed it, but the recording being played by those cutouts was the Voyager Golden Record, specifically the line, "Hello from the children of planet Earth" in every language. The caveman cutout and the Voyager record each imply a different important detail to me about information that Async suspects to be true about the backrooms. The first is that it can pull from locations other than just Earth. The goal of the Voyager record was so that any other species that finds it would be able to use the messages to decode our language and realize that there was intelligent life on Earth. Unlike the Voyager record, this also pulls the double duty of allowing any human who has pulled through the backrooms to hear a message and know there are other humans that have been here regardless of their native language. Secondly, the image of the caveman is interesting to me in particular because if you were only expecting extraterrestrials, you would want to give them an idea of what modern man looks like. However, if Async suspects that the null zones are able to pull objects from any time period, it would make sense to put an image that most resembles what man looked like for the majority of our history. Async treating the backrooms like they are part of space, waiting to be explored, directly ties in with how little Async understands about the backrooms. Ultimately, the character who best understands how the backrooms works is Clark, who spent his time in the backrooms trying to become as close to a native as someone from our reality can be, to the point that he makes the choice to stay in the backrooms prior to being killed by his double. The person who best understands the backrooms from a conceptual standpoint is Mary, who by the end of the movie seems to have a realization that the backrooms cannot be understood by humans, and the attempt to do so is dangerous both to those exploring and those on the outside. Meanwhile, the people who seem to understand the least about the backrooms are Async, who are depicted at the end asking Mary if she has any details from her time that would help them to better understand the backrooms. Before I go on to talking about just the thematic material of the film, there's one detail that I feel like a lot of people are taking as word of God coming from Clark that I don't think is intended to be. And that's the idea that they have no feelings, emotions, or connections to their real-world counterparts. The audience is really expected to use the double of Clark and his wife Barbara to be able to make a few inferences about how the doubles work. The first is that while Clark is being chased in the laundry room scene, there's a memory being shouted at him that is about him locking Barbara out of the house. It's from this quick scene and an admission during the dinner scene with Mary that Clark is first implied and then shown to be more abusive than he represented in therapy. All of this is important for two critical reasons. The first is that the only double that the audience sees engaging in violence is Clark's double, so that alone is a reason to believe that these doubles partially have their personality imprinted on them from their real-world counterpart. However, we are given one other clue to drive the point home. When Clark's double, which I've seen called both Pirate Clark or Captain Clark, after his furniture store, enters the same room as Barbara's double runs to the corner to hide. There are a few other details that hint at how bad the abuse is before he directly tells Mary, such as how quickly Clark was willing to scout Barbara's double during the dinner scene, or how he couldn't even hide his abusive nature at the beginning in a therapy roleplay session. But the film contains more than enough information for the audience to infer that Clark is an explosively abusive alcoholic fairly early in the film. Everything that I talked about so far encompasses really the narrative of the movie, how that narrative interacts with the web series, and a few standalone details of the movie's narrative itself. But there's also a lot to the backrooms that gets added in terms of theming throughout this movie. The backrooms doubles, or still lifes, as I've seen the fandom refer to them online, are a new addition to the world of Parsons' backrooms. Prior to the addition of the still lifes, the primary threat within the backrooms came from one of two places, although really these are the same place. The first is that people who go into the backrooms without proper protective equipment, that is, the people who fall in through null zones and aren't experimenting there as part of Async, seem to begin to succumb to some kind of fungal infection that begins with them coughing a bunch. But the second threat is directly tied to this. Once they die from this infection, they begin to transform into a kind of walking fungus shaped vaguely like a human because the biology remembers the shape of its original host, kind of like how the backrooms remembers doubles. However, as early as found footage number 3, which isn't that early, it's kind of the unofficial finale of the web series or the lead into the film, Parsons there is beginning to play with the idea of entities in his backrooms other than the fungaloids. The film, though, is where he really has a chance to flesh out these concepts and tie them to the themes that he wants to talk about in his art. From the way that the Backrooms creates its doubles, to the way that they look, to their internal organs, all of these reflect a scathing critique of AI. The way that the Backrooms creates doubles is by combing through people's memories and constructing them based on those memories. So right away, that's similar to the process that AI creates new work, which is by sampling the work of other people. Clark describes the process as the Backrooms remembering, but just like how AI can't really think, the Backrooms can't really remember. The Backrooms also does not create the doubles in a way that looks visually appealing. Lastly, according to Clark, the doubles are not able to feel pain, emotion, or anything that makes a person human. Their inhumanity is even emphasized when Clark's able to rip into their stomach and show that they contain no real substance, no soul, just white fluff. Essentially, the work is calling the creation of the Backrooms soulless, artificial, and incapable of everything that makes a human human. I wonder where we've heard all of that before. The other theme that Kane spends a great deal of time on is the theme of nostalgia. Specifically, the idea that nostalgia is either toxic or hollow, that it is not really a positive emotion to be feeling. Despite being a period piece set not only during the 1990s, but I will say to my viewers, the day of Clark's exposition with his employees is literally the day I was born, July 3rd, 1990. The Backrooms really takes a negative position on nostalgia despite this framing, however. One of the areas where the film paints a negative picture of nostalgia is in Clark's doomed expedition with his employees. When Clark is fleeing from the laundry room into the room with the Christmas tree, we would expect that room to represent a more safe space in a hackneyed film, but instead we're treated to Clark being accosted for the first time by the double of his ex-wife. Likewise, Kane really tries to emphasize that the hope found in nostalgia is a false hope. One of the most pressing issues of our time is the apartheid and genocide of Palestinians at the hands of Israel. But the early 90s were not a time without apartheid either. Instead of offering his younger audience a chance to escape into the nostalgia away from the problems that bother them today, Bobby, the boyfriend of Clark's employee, is wearing a Stop Apartheid shirt. Furthermore, as an audience, we're told that the Stop Apartheid shirt is important thematically and an intentional choice in costuming when in the laundry room, Bobby discovers an identical copy of his Stop Apartheid shirt right before his death. Speaking of apartheid, one of the details that apartheid evokes is the unfair absurdity of our own reality. The theme of unreality and the absurdity of our reality is even one that Kane is on record as intentionally trying to evoke with the scenes that happen outside of the Backrooms. The scene that most people have been pointing to as intentionally painting our reality as uncanny are the hills that are shown behind Clark's furniture store. The mountains look more like something that belongs in a touched-up Windows screensaver picture than in a physical space. I've even seen some people online trying to suggest that the characters of the film are in the Backrooms the entire time. However, there's no real additional narrative depth added by having them literally be in the Backrooms. It seems more likely that what Parsons is suggesting is that our reality is absurd, cruel, and governed by rules indifferent to your continued existence in the same way as the Backrooms. That theme is best exemplified in the scenes with Mary and her mother, where Mary is forbidden from leaving their trailer as a familiar, sickly yellow light pours in through the windows, letting us know that the aesthetics and rules of the Backrooms are never really that far away, even when we're in our own reality. One of the details that I loved about this movie is how it wears its inspirations on its sleeve. There were two details of the film that I really appreciated as someone who had watched Parsons' interviews about his creative process and what inspired the film. The first is the scene where Mary goes into the Backrooms to try to find Clark. Upon finding him, she sees a mural on the wall that looks exactly like one of the Ratman dens from the first Portal game. The second is when he said he was inspired by Punishment Park, which takes a very sardonic look at a serious issue, draft dodging of the Vietnam War. One of the scenes that I believe to be inspired by Punishment Park is the end interview scene between the scientists working for Async and Mary. One of the aspects that I liked about that scene that was already a subversion of common storytelling tropes that a recent story in memory failed, Stranger Things, which was having the scientists explaining the situation to Mary ultimately really not know any more information than Mary does. However, there's another part of this scene that I feel was even more inspired by Punishment Park. There are parts of this scene that feel a bit like a metatextual reference to the original web series. When the scientist interviewing Mary is showing her pictures and asking her to confirm certain plot relevant details, it's very reminiscent to people holding up blurry security camera pictures of Peter, one of the key characters in the web series, and asking questions like, is this the same character from that other episode? I felt like this was really the perfect way to reference the original series as a source material within the film without putting so much of a hat on it that it really detracts from the art of the film itself. Now, I don't want to paint a picture that the film was all positive. There were elements of the psychodrama aspects that I felt were a little heavy-handed, and times where the dialogue felt clunky. But without some form of script control, I think you can only expect so much from Parsons. I'd be disappointed if we don't see some growth between this film and his next feature, but given the amount of growth we've already seen from him over the course of his web series, and now from transferring over to his web series to this film, I'm more than confident that he's going to mature into one of the better storytellers of his generation. Thanks for joining me today on a little bit of an explanation and a review of Parsons' new Backrooms movie. I promise that I'm going to have you back to your regularly scheduled programming of mostly horror literature later this week. However, I would have felt like a fool for not talking about a horror film that has people who don't even love genre fiction in the theaters. That's it for me. Stay gold out there, folks.